Well, thank you all for coming, and we will do our best to reward your quixotic and maybe masochistic decision to come in here instead of being out on this beautiful day and make this panel worth your while. And it is apt that we're doing this in a naval hospital commissioned by Lincoln, given the subject. Jim's book is absolutely terrific. It does so many different things, but I want to start by asking you about. I mean, there's several overriding themes that run throughout the book, and I want to cover each of them in turn. But one of the themes, and obviously we'll get to the kind of issue of sickness in particular, and smallpox epidemics and dysentery and all these sorts of things. But you talk at various times about how in conventional American history, or conventional views of American history, emancipation is seen as kind of, as you put it, a shotgun moment, great triumph, a sort of transitional moment from slavery to freedom. And in some senses it was. And yet the sense you get from reading your book is that for the freed slaves, for the freedmen, it was anything but that. It was actually, as you put it, rather grueling in many, many ways. And you talk about all the different facets of that. But could you talk a little bit about how, again, the shorthand view of emancipation was there was a break point in 1863, right, and then the end of the Civil War when right, and all these people who had been in bondage are free. Right. Everything's great. That's not the way it played out for those people day to day.
Right. So that's a great question. One of the ways that I thought about it was that when you think about the moment of emancipation, there is this shotgun moment of liberation. Either formerly enslaved or enslaved people hear that a Union army is advancing and they'll run towards that army in order to get shelter. Or they might know of Lincoln's emancipation and they'll liberate themselves out of plantation slavery. But that's a day, 2 days. How do they survive on the second or third day? Where do they find food? Where do they find shelter? How do they live? And so in many ways, the Emancipation Proclamation was created as a military strategy. Yep. It was an effort to really get black men to enlist in the army. And so the question becomes, what happens to women and children? And what happens to the men who don't enlist in the army, the elderly, or those who are not considered, in the 19th century parlance, able-bodied? So on one level, you have this massive emancipation of people, and there's no infrastructure. And so if you just think about the 19th century for a second, there's two ways. There's one way most people would get support in the 19th century, through charity hospitals. So buildings like this, but they were often devoted to particular groups. So you would have Irish people created their own, or Jewish people created their own. So in other words, the charitable institutions were often affiliated with various forms of identity. And then what happens is, even in some counties, in some states, you would have a municipal charity home. But even at that moment, they used to just say anyone can come, sick, disabled, whomever, poor. At that moment, they start saying only citizens can come. Mm-hmm. And black people at that moment were in this nebulous political position. They weren't enslaved, they weren't freed. So there's no infrastructure to take care of them at this particular moment. And as a result, they're scavenging, they're trying to find food, they're trying to find rations. And even when the army wants to help them, the army doesn't even have enough supplies or food in order for people to survive. So that's also part of it. I also just want to sort of say that that's the structural issue, that there isn't an institution, there isn't someone to help them provide food. But now here I'm just going to ratchet it up a little bit in terms of how we have this memory of liberation. This memory of liberation, as the panelists were talking about before, comes down to us from 19th century writers who are very much invested in telling a certain history about the Civil War in the South. And people like the historian David Blight at Yale University has charted how each generation from the 1870s to the 1900s to the 1940s to the 1960s has had a different interpretation of the war. And often when you're reading about the War of this Liberation, you're not reading about how people in the 1860s understood it. You're reading about how people in the 1890s understood it and wrote about it, and sort of create this narrative. So former slaves, I don't know if they would recognize part of this narrative. I think we like to think that they would, and I think there are moments when they do. They understood freedom, but they're not understanding it purely as this moment of jubilee in the way that I think we do. That's, every time I hear that, I think that's an 1890s sentence. That's not an 1862 sentence.
Well, I want to come back to your notion of this sort of nebulous zone that the freedmen occupied, during the kind of process of emancipation.
Right.
But you talk in the book about how scant the data and the records are about, what it was. There's sort of statistical data, kind of later on.
Yeah.
But and there's sort of somewhat limited firsthand accounts from the former slaves' perspective.
Right.
And yet you do actually manage to have, and these are incredible. One of the things that's fantastic about the book is that you're combining kind of this from 10,000 feet narrative history with this very granular human account. And you have a few cases. In the introduction you talk about I think it's a kid who shows up who the Union soldiers look at him and he's like his feet are going to have to get amputated.
Right.
There's another case a couple chapters on about, and this gets into the sort of nebulous quality where even before emancipation, people, the slaves are trying to in this below the Mason-Dixon are trying to flee to the north, but of course then they show up. And the Union soldiers don't exactly know what to do with them, so sometimes they'll put them in these kind of encampments within the. And even there, and there's this just absolutely wrenching story about this family where he moves with his whole family to the Union camp, and then the Union camp, for whatever sort of military prerogatives, decide that we need to move all the families out. They move, to some boarding house a little ways away. His entire family, he's walking back and forth 8 miles each way. The entire family dies. So just talk a little about the sort of human stories that you came across.
So one of the things to sort of think about in working on this was that most of the stories of formerly enslaved people come from white pens, come from white people. And they don't come from white people who have a systematic interest in documenting black people, and not because they're racist, just because they're army officials. They follow protocols. They follow protocols for, if we need more rations, we fill out this form. If we need more supplies from the quartermasters, we fill out this form. And so as a result, what happened is, for generations, no one talked about the medical conditions of the freed slaves because, in large part, in the National Archives, not too far from here, there's not necessarily tons and tons of boxes that detail this, because their experience only comes down to us through a phrase in this particular sentence or one particular letter. And so you have to kind of piece it together. So I was very, very lucky. After the war, that changes. So during Reconstruction, they create a medical division and they create a hospital system that people don't know about. And then they start collecting records and we get more data. But even then, it's statistical. It's just how many people need blankets, how many people need rations, how many people are in this hospital. It's actually just like, you can look at this later, but it's actually just like this report here, which is the number that entered, the number that died, and then some kind of statistic about it. But it's unclear when you're looking at these reports. It changes over time. So this is 61, 62, 63, and it's these numbers: 65 soldiers, 572 soldiers, 2,000 soldiers. You don't know by looking at that are these the same soldiers being carried through? Are these different soldiers? So it comes down to us, even when they have records, in the statistics. But we can't really get the human shape of the experience. I was really lucky because, as Edna was saying, was saying a couple seconds ago, she was talking about there's Harriet Jacobs. I mean, there's Harriet Tubman and there's Sojourner Truth, but there are also other black women from the Civil War era that we don't talk about. One of them is Harriet Jacobs. And Dr. LaRoche was talking about the problems of sources. And from the 19th century, from the end of the 19th century down until about 1982, one important autobiography was written, the only one we know, from an enslaved woman named Harriet Jacobs. And when Harriet Jacobs wrote her autobiography, she wrote it to mimic Douglass's story of what it was like to be in slavery and to give the woman's experience and to provide a narrative about the sexual abuse that women faced. In abolitionist circles, it was really great. Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't like it that much because she felt it was rivaling her story of Uncle Tom's Cabin. She wanted to be the person who told the story of slavery. Douglass did like it, but it really did move the abolitionist movement forward, and it got a lot of women involved because it showed the problems that women faced, mostly the separation from women from their children during slavery. So the point is, the book sells really well during the antebellum period. When the war happens, Jacobs comes to DC. She works in one of these refugee camps here in Alexandria. After the war, people dismiss the book. People begin to think that it was a white woman's narrative, that it was abolitionist propaganda. There's no way this black woman wrote it because the language is so beautiful, the language is so ornate. And as Professor LaRouche said a few minutes ago in the previous panel, there were illiteracy laws. There were literacy laws that prevented black people from learning to read and write. And on top of it, there were white people who posed as black people to sell books, right? Which is another kind of it was just one of these things that happened. And you can imagine this today with hip hop, if certain white artists tried to appear black anyway. So this has been going on for a while. But the point is, 1880s, 1890s, 1900s, 1910s, 1920s, dismissed. No one believed it. So this is like Professor LaRouche. This isn't a real story. We have to ignore it. 1970s, 1980s, a literary critic thinks there might be something to the story. And what she does is Harriet Jacobs publishes it under the name of Linda Brent. And she publishes under the name of Linda Brent because she's a fugitive slave. And so she has to change all of the names in the book. Something, trips off this historian, this detective in the 1970s, and she thinks that this woman, Harriet Jacobs, who's working among the freedmen in the camps, is actually Linda Brent. And she goes through the systematic analysis, matches the names, goes back to the homes, finds these homes, does all of this stuff where Harriet Jacobs lives, and proves that she was, in fact, the author of Incidents in the Life of the Slave Girl. So fast forward 10 years. She's now writing the biography of Harriet Jacobs. And here's where I enter. I get to work as her research assistant. And this is a woman, Harriet Jacobs is a woman who was doubted for over a century, everything she said. And the notion of sickness was often in the way that people talk about black inferiority today, or black people exaggerate, or black people weren't really sick, it's not really true, da-da-da. So when she was stationed in Alexandria to a freedmen's hospital, and in a contraband camp, she's writing just a sentence here or a sentence there, these people are sick. And she's sending these letters to Quakers in the North. And the Quakers in the North are sending her blankets, they're sending her food. As Edna was saying, they were sent to be teachers to these areas. And once they got there, they realized that people were sick. So I know this is like a very long way of telling the story, but I just want to kind of explain how I got to this and how this history works, and to sort of connect it to the previous panel. I started to believe Harriet Jacobs. I found one clue in Harriet Jacobs that talked about health, and I spent most of my graduate career trying to find other examples. And so where do the stories of black people come from when there's not a systematic way of talking about it? They come from, at times, white people who were sympathetic. So in Massachusetts, of all places, you're thinking, here's the Civil War, it's taking place in the South, it's taking place in Louisiana, it's taking place in all these different places. The Massachusetts Historical Society has voluminous records of what these white Quaker teachers were doing in the South, and they write very poignantly about the black experience, and they talk about health. And then once I found those sources, I was then able to get back to the federal records, and I was able to sort of make more sense of these narratives. But it's also now it's tricky. Now this is the tricky part, and you can think about this today in terms of other questions about black health, just the way it plays out in the culture. Black people didn't want to emphasize they were sick.
Yeah.
They didn't want to tell people, because if they did, they thought it played into the 19th century propaganda that black people weren't prepared for freedom. And that before the war started, when abolitionists would go into the South and say, free the slaves, the South would say, they're better off here. Like, this is the notion of the happy slave. They can take care of themselves. That we provide them with 3 square meals. They're healthy. They'll be fine here. And so as a result, sickness was political. And black people knew that. And so they knew that getting in front of a white doctor wasn't just about getting aid and getting assistance. It also meant possibly triggering a narrative that said, we're unfit for freedom. So that's also the reason why this Jubilee narrative of emancipation kind of takes off, because it's purposely attempting to masquerade the narrative
Well,
about,
it's funny. You just teed up my next question, which was, one challenge that you or any historian looking at this period faces is that you've got these competing narratives from propagated mainly by Northern abolitionists, which is exactly this is the Jubilee moment, and it's in their interest to actually downplay the amount of suffering and illness that's taking place, and then the pro-slavery, former slave-owning South who's saying, look, we told you, they have an interest in actually exaggerating what was a real problem. They're basically saying, without us, actually the black race is going to go extinct because look at the rates of smallpox after 1862. So how do you actually, has that been corrected now over?
It hasn't. I mean, I think I finished my dissertation in 2005. And in 2006, when I was thinking about the revision for the book, I was like, I don't know how I'm going to do this. I don't know how I'm going to fix it. I don't know how I'm going to turn this into a manuscript. And then Katrina happened. And one of the things about Hurricane Katrina was that it replayed all of these debates. It first of all blamed black people for not getting out of their homes. It then created all of these narratives about the Superdome, about how black people were living in the Superdome, and the rapes in the Superdome, and the violence in the Superdome, and black health. And it was sort of locked into a particular way of telling the story of Katrina. And so one of the things that I try to do is, I think that the history is in so many ways how these various narratives compete. So I kind of try to lay them out. And then I try to sort of think about, who are the major actors and what's at stake. And so even when the federal government gets involved, as they did in Katrina or as they did after the Civil War, why? And they're not interested. I mean, when Lincoln creates, when we were walking up the steps and I was thinking about this hospital, I'm like, why does he create the Naval Hospital? And so in the 21st century, you think, well, the federal government does stuff. They need to do stuff. We're in a crisis. Obamacare, this, help, provide assistance. In the 19th century, they don't work that way. So they're not thinking of the federal government as being that expansive, as providing that kind of support. So what's inspiring them? And the answer is labor. The federal government really wants to return freed slaves back to the plantation south to work, to replant cotton. And what emancipation does do is it creates this massive spread of people all over the South. And people are looking for kin networks. They're looking for family members. They're looking for employment. They just don't want to be there anymore. They're just moving. And it's the same kind of narrative you see with Katrina. Like, what is the narrative of Katrina about migration, and what's the actual reality? What's actually happening on the ground? And the only reason why the federal government became so invested was because they were trying to recreate the labor force. So it's once you think about that, it's so interesting when you follow these numbers. I'm just using this as an example, but the numbers, even in this case, they increase around 1863, then they start decreasing by 1866. You could say they're decreasing because according to the logic of this form, sickness is decreasing. You also have to realize that they stop wanting to count the number of people that are sick because they just, as people, don't want to be in the South anymore. They're soldiers that have fought in the war, that have been in the war for 3 or 4 years, and now they're out of the war, and they are commissioned to be in the South, and so they start counting fewer people in an effort to show that the health conditions have improved and an effort to say that this hospital no longer needs to exist, and as a way to sort of close the hospital. So this room that we're sitting in, it didn't close, right? It stayed open for 200 years, 100 years, 100 or so years. In the Civil War South and in the 19th century, hospitals opened and closed all the time. And they opened and closed based on the number of sick patients. So if you had a declining sick population, that was also one of the reasons to close the hospital. So it would suggest health improved when in fact it actually could be related to labor or many other issues.
I want to come back to the federal response to all of this, but one thing that is really striking about the book that you come back to a number of times is that the Civil War, everybody knows that it was the most lethal war
Right.
In terms of American
Right.
deaths in the history
Right.
of America. But you talk about it was also the biggest biological crisis
Right.
of the 19th century. And it's sort of striking to think that fewer people died in combat or
Right.
from combat wounds than actually from disease and
Right.
after the fact.
Right.
Talk about that and why is that significant?
Well, I think it's significant for a few reasons. So again, just to connect to the previous panel and the discussion the panelists were having about how we remember the war, and we literally create these statues of soldiers as a way of epitomizing their great honor. You realize more soldiers died from disease than from these notions of heroic battle. This is all romance. These soldiers died from measles, they died from camp diseases, they died from pneumonia, they died from these types of things, smallpox. They died from these types of diseases because the Civil War unfolds before the advent of microbiology, before people understand germs. And so I just will always give this example. I learned it when I was an undergraduate. You can remember it now. Before the Civil War broke out, at the University of Pennsylvania, in the dormitories, there was one toothbrush per floor. You all say ooh because you live in a period after the notion of bacteria and after germs. You all understand that. Without an understanding of germs and bacteria, they have no idea. It's like, hey, who's got the toothbrush? Hank does. Yeah.
They didn't understand that malaria came from mosquitoes. either.
Right. So there's no understanding of invisible agents that you and I recognize as germs. So you can imagine when people became sick, they often didn't know what was changing. And right before the Civil War, medical historians would tell you they went through a major transformation, which was they started to think about sanitation. They started to think about the fact that, if something's dirty, that could in fact lead to sickness. Again, you're thinking this is obvious, but just when I walked through this hospital, I was interested in going to the front rooms, and I was looking at the windows, and it's not just, oh, let's look at the windows because it's a nice design and it shows us the park or the houses across the street. The windows are there for ventilation. And before even they had a theory about, even above, even these movable, above the doors, the flaps, the window, right, they are to create ventilation. You and I understand that as a sort of basic form of remaining healthy, but in the 19th century they didn't. And so they would create the Sibley teepee, the tents, with a little hole at the top. That was to sort of just create a better airflow. They didn't understand germs. The most advanced hygienicist of the time understood something called carbolic acid poisoning. That was one
ventilation.
Right.
Yeah.
So in other words, medicine at the time in many ways was very advanced compared to an earlier period where people thought people became sick because you were a sinner, because you were poor, because of a certain social class, and it didn't matter. In England, in the United States during the Civil War, if you caught smallpox, it was because you were lower class or you were black, you're more susceptible to it. But is the reverse logic in England? If you look at Dickens, only the wealthy could catch smallpox, not the poor. So there's no it's not like all poor people get sick. I mean, every culture develops its own sort of etology, its own way of understanding it. The point is that they don't really understand how germs are spreading. And so you're in these crowded environments, you're in these sanitary environments, and what's happening is sickness explodes. Now, that said, here's an interesting piece. In the 18th century, anytime there was an outbreak of smallpox, they didn't understand germ theory, but they understood contagion. So they would say, if you're infected with smallpox, you should be quarantined to an area. And we can have a debate or a discussion about vaccination versus inoculation and what that meant and how that differed. But the protocol across the board was, if you are infected, we'll remove you. That was adopted throughout the Union Army, and both the Union Army and the Confederate Army. In the records, 2 or 3 cases of smallpox would signal an epidemic to both the Union and the Confederates. And they would immediately take that soldier and place that person in a quarantine area. When smallpox exploded among freed people in the Sea Islands, and we were talking about the rivers in South Carolina earlier and where Harriet Tubman went, 700-800 freed people in one location in the Sea Islands, 400 cases of smallpox, no declaration of an epidemic. It's almost like the way Reagan didn't talk about the HIV epidemic. It was like this same history plays out. Reagan would not acknowledge that HIV was spreading into an epidemic proportions among gay people in the 1980s. Same thing among smallpox, among freed slaves. It was exploding in record numbers, in hundreds and the thousands, and it wasn't considered an epidemic, whereas 2 or 3 among whites was. So that's also another way you can sort of think about how people were still, even though they knew the protocol, when it came to black people, they were still falling back on these racial theories about black inferiority.
Well, and you've got tons of stuff in the book that's fascinating about different ideas that African Americans were either more or less susceptible to different diseases, and then there's a sort of fascination among northern doctors, like let's go look and see what smallpox looks on black skin. But one thing that was sort of fascinating historical detail is that, as you note, that there was no real understanding of microbiology or germ theory of contagion, and yet they were starting to understand, medical science was starting to understand that that the physical environment had an effect on, and so that you had, based on what they'd learned from watching the Crimean War, where the Russians and the British were fighting in the Crimean Peninsula, when they'd established a United Kingdom Sanitary Commission, the Northern Americans started sanitation, and then would actually go down to the South and try to clean up some of these.
So this is an interesting story. So it begins at the Battle of Bull Run, which is in Manassas, Virginia, and everyday Americans have these romantic notions of war. And so the war's coming, so they pack a picnic lunch and they go down to observe it and to watch it. And when they get down there, the war turns out to be this gruesome battle. And it's in the early stages of the war, and the Union soldiers are wearing gray uniforms instead of blue, and the Confederates are wearing blue instead of gray. And so there's massive carnage, there's massive confusion, and the Union soldiers begin running back to D.C., and that's when the term skedaddle comes into play. Like, they skedaddle, they run away. And what happens is, there are tons of bodies of soldiers left on the battlefield, and there's no infrastructure to even respond to white soldiers, and there's no ambulances to lift them up. And the Surgeon General's office in D.C. was basically just it was like a nice post. It was a sinecure for retired guys, for retired Army surgeons. So they didn't have the infrastructure. And what you have is a group of Northern abolitionists and reformers that are meeting in New York City that find out about the fact that all of these bodies are just left. The dead bodies are a problem, and it's sad. But it's the injured bodies. It's the guy who has a broken leg. It's the person who's been shot in the stomach and is bleeding and can't move. And they just to imagine what that looked like, and they didn't have the infrastructure to carry them away, and they didn't have anyone to respond to it. And so the Northern reformers know what happens in the Crimean War. They come down to Washington, D.C., and they say to Lincoln, we must create some kind of sanitary commission to help them. And Lincoln agrees, and basically what the sanitary commission does is it goes in to various camps, and it starts removing the dead bodies, and it begins burying them. And there's an excellent book by Drew Faust about this called The Republic of Suffering, of just how do you even create cemeteries and burial grounds. Then the question is, what about dead animals? I mean, this is when we, you think about the Civil War, we have this imagery of this noble war, this romantic war. We still hold on to this today. What about dead horses, disabled horses, injured horses? These horses they thought it was good just to dump the dead bodies into the water stream, in the same water streams that they would defecate in, the same water streams they would drink. And so, they would have to pass around these circulars that said, don't do this. And they would, so the sanitary commissions would go in, and of course the soldiers don't want to listen to sanitary commission agents who are mostly women, who are coming in and telling people what to do. They're ignoring them. So the war is a biological crisis, and that's just for the white people. This is to say nothing of what happens for formerly enslaved people at this time.
Well, and you'll do a better job of telling this story
Yeah.
than I will, because you're more familiar with it. But speaking of dead bodies, there's this horrific story you tell of, and I can't remember, it was again one of these freedmen families,
Right.
where the mother is at a Union encampment,
Right.
and her son dies of illness, and she keeps trying to go, and this is actually told again through a white woman's
Right.
perspective,
Right.
and she keeps going to the Union commander and saying,
Right.
could you please bury my son? He's getting eaten by wharf rats.
Right.
To tell that
So
story.
basically, she realizes her son is sick. And so she goes and she petitions the captain, and he ignores her, he brushes her off. We're all sick, who cares? So then she goes to the northern woman who runs the camp, who's like ladling out soup. And she says, okay, I will be your advocate. I will go and help. And she explains to the captain what happened. And the captain says, don't you know they come up with all kinds of excuses? So this is if this was the crawl, this would be like the welfare queen stories of the 80s, right? Like this would be like the same thing. They make up
lazy
right,
lingerers, yeah.
They make up this is not really true, blah, 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 blah. And so essentially, she goes back to the woman and sees what happened to the woman, see how the child's doing, and the child died that quickly. So then, this is war. So the camp has to be evacuated. So now the captain has given this black woman and the other black people an order that they have to get on the boat and leave. And so she says, I'll get on this boat, but what's going to happen to my child? Can he have a proper burial? So again, she goes through the same chain of commands, through the various people, and the captain says, no, we don't even have a winding sheet for my own soldiers. We don't have enough resources for my own soldiers. We can't even bury them. I can't bury her. And she says, well, I was out earlier this morning. I went to the wharf. I saw the wharf rats, nibbling on the bodies of the enslaved children who were dead. And I don't want to leave my child here for the wharf rats to eat. And so basically what happens is Laura Haviland, who's the white woman, was like, okay, we're going to get this child buried. And at that moment, she tells the woman, we're going to bury your child. You need to get on the boat. And the woman gets on the boat. Now, I don't want to tell the story anymore from the perspective of the white woman. I want to tell the story now from the black woman, because the story is published in 1892. That black woman gets on the boat. She has no idea what's going to happen to her child. As far as she knows, her child's there. She has a promise from this white woman, which according to the white woman, 40 years later in 1892, she publishes the story, and she says it's buried. We don't know. From the vantage point of that black woman, we don't know what happens. We know that a war that was meant to free her, that she got to leave slavery with her child, was in and of itself a major victory. Anyone knows, look at Solomon Northup, 12 years a slave. Mothers and children are separated during the war. Before the war, during abolition, during slavery. She held on to her child. Yet it's during the war that her child dies, and it's during the war when she's standing on that boat and it's sailing away that she has no idea what will happen to her child. And her child's dead during a war that was meant to free her. Now, this is an interesting story because on one level, Laura Haviland paints it, and that's wonderful, and we love her, and she's a hero. But as I forget her last name, and I keep going Dr. Edna something. It's Medfield, right? And I'm Medford, right? And Medford, sorry. So as Dr. Medford said, everybody has their own interest in writing a source. So part of the reason why this white woman writes it is because she wants people to be like, wow, look what you did during the war, you're a hero. Because in the 1890s, everybody was writing these hero stories. But I want to think about how her story is a clue, as Dr. LaRouche was saying, of all of the other black women, the nameless black women whose children were left on that wharf, who died, whose bodies remained there, who were never buried, and who never even made it into a sentence of a narrative.
I want to make sure we have enough time for
I'm sorry, I'm going.
for questions, but I have two
Yeah.
sort of
Yeah.
very different final questions for you.
Right,
for
okay.
you. And one is, going from the up to the kind of policy level.
Yeah.
One of the really interesting arguments that your book makes is that, and this is relevant in some ways to today with the Affordable Care Act and all
Right,
that, but
right.
that actually the creation of the medical division of the Freedmen's Bureau
Right.
was actually a transformational moment in the kind of expansion of federal government's role
Yeah.
in dealing with
Yeah.
the lives and welfare of individual
Right,
people. Do you want to talk
right.
about that a little bit? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this was the book. I was then finishing the book just as questions about the Affordable Health Care Act developed. And one of the things I found really interesting was that it was as if President Obama was the first to talk about this or to think about these issues, and that the response against it was like this was the first response against federally sponsored healthcare. And in fact, we can go back to the Civil War and see that the federal government created 40 hospitals, they employed 120 doctors, and they provided health care to over 1 million freed people from 1865 to 1870. In fact, Howard University Medical School here in DC was one of the last freedmen's hospitals that existed in the country. Many of them collapsed, as I mentioned earlier, during Reconstruction and then in the 1870s. But all of the union doctors continue to put their money and their resources together to keep it open for some time. In fact, it's named after O.O. Howard, who is in fact the head of the Freedmen's Bureau.
Although it's interesting that even at as this first sort of foray of the federal government into, which was a radical concept at the
Right.
time, you already had the kind of tropes and narratives about and fears like, oh, you're just creating dependency.
Right, exactly.
If we're helping these indigent former slave freedmen, this is going to cultivate a culture of dependency. Or something like that.
Right. So
even
again,
then.
So again, these narratives that we have today about dependency and the fear that federal assistance is going to hurt people rather than help them, that could be traced in the 19th century.
I wanted to do just two final things before we open up to questions. So there are two quotes I wanted to read from your book that sort of stood out to me, and you can either respond to them or I'll just leave them there.
Right.
But there was one moment, this is in the chapter The Anatomy of Emancipation, where, again, you're talking about the story you were just talking about, the rats gnawing on
Right.
And you almost sort of have to step back and you say, maybe the historian here, well, actually, you actually step back a second.
Right.
You're asking, why would this northern woman want to record this? And you say,
Right.
most likely the gruesome picture of rats gnawing on lifeless children propelled her to action was scorched in her memory. Maybe the historian here falls into the same trap as Laura Haviland, who's the white woman,
Right.
emotionally hooked by the drama of death and dying. How else can we tell of what could have been and how it all went down? Cries of suffering were not entered into the official historical record. Fear was not cataloged in a database under freedom. Dead children's names did not appear on bronze memorial plaques in city halls after the war ended. So what shall we do? Let the freed woman linger in the accented and abbreviated language of a diary? What do we do about this? Clearly,
Right.
this was a moment where you felt like you had to interject
Right.
yourself in a way that you don't in the rest of the
Right,
book.
so that's my favorite part of the book, actually. And maybe because I'm egotistical and it's me and it's narcissistic. But I worried, okay, so I worried about recreating Precious. Did you see the film Precious? Do you know the film Precious? Do you know so one, and I've written on Precious for the Chronicle and other places. One of the problems is in the in the early 2000s, maybe not, 2010 maybe, 2009, a film is released called Precious, and it's about this black woman who's living in the ghetto, who's sexually abused, illiterate, raped by her father, contracts AIDS, has a child with Down syndrome. I mean, it's just like every negative possible stereotype about black people is like grafted onto this person's body. And I mean, I raise this question at time. It's like, we don't need to see this anymore. I mean, it's part of the reason why something like Barack Obama emerges as such an iconic figure, because he intuitively dispels this other narrative of black suffering that we've seen for so long. So I worried about writing another book where I saw black people suffering and black people's death and black people's dying. But at the same time, I felt like Precious is not hooked up to a particular social justice agenda, right? So it's like, let's just throw that image out there without any kind of reason. That someone like Chandra Rhimes has to come along and clean it all up. but the reality of it is that at this point, when we think about the Civil War, we still have bronze plaques with soldiers' names on it. We still have these statues that memorialize it in this different way. And that part of the war was this casualty. Part of the war was black people, not just in the Denzel Washington glory, fighting for the cause, participating, wearing the soldier's uniform, doing it. Part of it meant dying. Part of it meant suffering. And so I decided to include these narratives and to write this book to puncture a hole in the mythology about how we saw it, but all the while recognizing that the book could be perpetrating another narrative about black inferiority, suffering. You know, I taught, before I became a professor, I taught middle school and high school, and I taught at a black, it was called an Afrocentric middle school, the Ivy Leaf Middle School in Philadelphia. And it was founded by black civil rights activists. All the students, all the faculty were black. And when the headmaster found that I was going to teach slavery, he said no. And he said, you're not allowed to teach. He was an older guy, he was an older gentleman. He's about his 70s. He said, you're not allowed to teach slavery to these children because it's a downtrodden moment in our history. Instead, tell them something about Tiger Woods. Tell them, and there was this, there was this other moment, and that is, and I know this from, personal experience, familial experiences, my own families and so forth, that there is that feeling among certain black people not to tell that story because it perpetrates that kind of image of suffering, that people, kids grow up with that. They don't want to see that anymore. It does have a psychological effect on them. So I was very aware of that when I wrote this, and I was trying not to fall into that story.
And we'll go to questions in a second, but
Yeah.
this final quote actually goes right to that, where,
Yeah.
and this is in the conclusion where you say, again, you're talking about Harriet Jacobs,
Right.
the
Yeah. Right.
turn
Right.
to the
Right.
earlier, she says, as Jacobs explained, there was no one by the sides of the sick and dying freed slaves. As she bent down to adjust a blanket or to offer a reassuring word, they looked up at her with tearful eyes that asked, is this freedom?
Right.
And this, to me, is sort of the core of,
Right,
the emancipation was obviously looked at from a distance, a glorious moment.
Right,
and
right.
sort of a great rectifying of
Right.
a egregious wrong, and yet the process was much more painful than we
Right.
maybe have recognized so far.
Right. So Harriet Jacobs is my hero, and so anytime I could sort of talk about her to sum up a point of the book, I did. And that's the question, is what is freedom? And I think that this is freedom. And freedom comes with struggle. And I think even the recent film Selma showed that. I mean, even for a generation that's so close to civil rights, they still think civil rights is just, Rosa Parks, or it's the bus boycotts, it's these silent moments of black people protesting. When you see something like Selma, you realize that freedom was having a bloody head, freedom was getting hit, freedom was being pathologized, freedom was getting, when King gets, I'm a historian, I didn't know that scene of King walking into the hotel and getting punched right in the face, flat out. That's freedom. Freedom is not just when he gets to say, letter from a Birmingham jail. Freedom is not just the I have a dream speech. Freedom is he gets punched in the face. And we need to see both of those narratives because that's what the struggle is about. Well,
Thank you very much to Jim, and thank you to all of you for coming out on a beautiful sunny day.
Awesome. Thank you. Appreciate it.